To really understand the nature of Uruk's interaction with these local communities, we have to kind of look at how they're differentiated. One of the main reasons that we can kind of identify these two sites is because we have different styles of architecture. The indigenous local late Chalcolithic societies show much more variation. Sometimes sites are constructed on a tripartite plan, but we also see circular structures, large bipartite structures, that is just two parallel rows of rooms, and stone architecture that follow more traditional local styles. The other thing that we see is the differences in pottery. Uruk pottery is gray, it's red slipped, and has those beveled rim bowls, as we've talked about. Local late Chalcolithic pottery oftentimes are handmade. They're largely undecorated, and they're covered in chaff. That is, there's rough clay chaff inclusions that were in it when it was fired that then burn out in the firing process. The most important of these sites is the site of Arslan Tepe in the Malatya Plain in central Anatolia. So this is on the upper Euphrates near the headwaters of the Euphrates, and we've already talked about a site that was important during the Ubaid period. That's Dayerman Tepe, and it's incredibly close to the copper mines in the region. So we know, based on the surface surveys, there's an Ubaid occupation at Arslan Tepe, but the lowest levels reached in excavations thus far date to the late Chalcolithic II, just after the end of the Ubaid period, and we see small tripartite domestic structures here. But in level 7 at the site, we see the emergence of relatively large distinctions between elites and commoners. There's a large columned bipartite temple complex, and then there are houses with larger elite structures, richer artifact inventories, and we see the production here of mass-produced string-cut based bowls. And so you can kind of see the differences here in domestic architecture versus the larger elite households here at level 7. But it's in level 6 that we see this expansion of Arslan Tepe into a relatively powerful state in and of its own right. It has a large public architecture, a temple platform, a large open air courtyard in between the temples, and we can kind of think of this as emerging out of controlling the access to local resources that were most certainly propped up in a lot of the same ways that we've already talked about with the demand of goods from southern Mesopotamia that we saw in Egypt. Controlling this trade would have given the leaders at Arslan Tepe an advantage and allowed them to consolidate power. The ceramic finds point to an extensive system of redistribution to the lower classes from the temple structures, including large-scale cooking facilities and the domination of these mass-produced string-cut bowls that likely function as ration containers similar to those bevel rim bowls at Uruk, Mesopotamia. Storage facilities themselves contained about 2,000 clay ceilings, suggesting a coordinated strategy of bureaucracy in the central administrative centers around the temple complexes. And then there are elite residential compounds that use different types of ceramics assemblages, and particularly these wheel-made fineware vessels excuse me, that are extremely different than we see from those in non-elite contexts. Now, the wheel-made fineware show some similarities in form and decoration to Uruk style, but they're built following local traditions, suggesting that if they are associated with the Uruk system, it's these groups of people at Arslan Tepe who are emulating Uruk styles rather than buying into the broader Uruk system. So Arslan Tepe represents kind of a competing polity, or a peer polity in Stein's model, for controlling access and trade in the region. Arslan Tepe would have been a formidable opponent for Uruk, Mesopotamia in terms of a militaristic scale. So we're likely looking at a more symmetrical trading relationship in the locations where we see these local polities. Now at Hamukar, we can see something relatively similar. We have a large local late Chalcolithic site on the upper Havor Valley, controlling access again to those copper mines in central Anatolia. And in the LC23, late Chalcolithic 2 or 3, corresponding with the beginning of the Middle Uruk, we see a settlement that has grown into, in its own right, a large administrative compound, probably about 28,000 inhabitants or so. And in the LC3, we see one of these Uruk outposts that are built into the settlement. It appears on the site, and it's built within the existing settlement, but contains a distinctly southern Mesopotamian material tradition. However, shortly after the arrival of the city, the entire site is burned in a fire. This is what has been talked about as being the earliest evidence for an extensive warfare in the world. The site is burned down, it's razed completely. There are 1,200 small and 120 large sling bullets that were found in the trash deposits associated with these remains, suggesting of an extensive siege. And then after the settlement is destroyed, it's subsequently almost immediately rebuilt by southern Mesopotamian inhabitants in Uruk style. So there's still some kind of question about the motivations behind this, but what we do know is that the site was burned down, both the indigenous settlement and the Uruk settlement. Now, we don't know that the Uruk settlement was burned because of retribution from southern Mesopotamia, bad trade relations or whatever, or if things soured in the relationship between Hamilcar and Uruk itself. But we do know that after the site was destroyed, it's rebuilt and established as one of these Uruk enclaves, a larger settlement of Uruk style, directly controlling access to those copper sources. So the working assumption has largely been that we're looking at a terra incognita, a blank slate landscape of state-level polities before the Uruk in Mesopotamia. But recent archaeological evidence is really showing that these local late Chalcolithic polities were complex enough in their own right to provide formidable resistance to Uruk Mesopotamia. And so we've kind of abandoned what Stein called the passive periphery model of Algaze's idea and looked at this as a way that researchers now have to kind of grapple with complex relationships with relatively powerful local polities within the Uruk sphere of influence. And we can kind of see this at sites like Godin Tepe. Here you see a small circular enclosure built into a walled community built into an existing settlement in the central Iranian highlands. Material remains inside of the circular wall here were of southern Mesopotamian style and in nature, while the rest of the settlement was was using those local late Chalcolithic materials. So Godin Tepe is one of these outposts that Algaze was talking about. And the best excavated and understood example of that is the site of Hajanebi Tepe in modern southeastern Turkey. So excavations by Gilstein here uncovered a distinct community of Uruk inhabitants, but they're living separately and apart from an indigenous community. There are close contacts between the two, but we see two very different cultural ways of life. Each community had its own distinct ceramic tradition. Each community had its own administrative techniques, with local inhabitants using stamp seals and Uruk inhabitants using cylinder seals. The Uruk settlement used clay sickles rather than flint sickles, even though there was readily available flints for harvesting grain. And we even see so much down to different kill patterns of when sheep and goat were butchered, to where we can really kind of talk about different cultural practices within the community. So if we kind of look at this, just to kind of break it down, this is the type of pottery we would find in the local late Chalcolithic assemblages at most of these sites, these large casseroles and hammerhead bowls for the daily consumption and preparation of food. Here you can see the local community engaging in processes for trade, copper smelting, and a clay axe mold to suggest that its access to the copper was an important region for the community here at Hajanebi Tepe. But in the Uruk deposits, we can see the very clear southern Mesopotamian style. Notice in the trash deposits, dozens of these almost complete bevel rim bowls are just turned up into the garbage, and the clay sickles that would have been used to harvest grain. So we can very clearly see distinct attitudes and differences of cultural practice at the site of Hajanebi.